The room smelled of polished wood, burnt espresso, and quiet fear. One careless sentence from the chairman had frozen 40 executives in place, but only one person had quietly stepped back without arguing. Nobody noticed the way the legal team avoided her eyes afterward. Nobody questioned why the finance director suddenly stopped speaking during the meeting. And absolutely nobody imagined that by sunrise, an entire multi-billion-dollar acquisition pipeline would collapse like glass under pressure. But in boardrooms, disasters rarely begin with shouting. Sometimes they begin with a refused handshake. At 7:40 a.m., the 42nd floor of the Halbrecht Tower already hummed with the sterile rhythm of expensive urgency. Assistants crossed the marble lobby, carrying tablets and paper folders they would never personally read. Elevator doors opened and closed like mechanical jaws. Coffee machines hissed, screens glowed. Somewhere in the distance, someone laughed too loudly at a joke that wasn't funny enough to deserve it. The headquarters of Halbrecht Global operated like an orchestra where nobody admitted they were afraid of the conductor. And today, everyone was afraid, because Chairman Victor Halbrecht was coming in early. People felt his arrival before they saw him. Conversation shortened, shoulders stiffened, even the reception staff unconsciously straightened their posture when the black sedan rolled under the steel awning outside. Victor entered the lobby without looking at anyone directly. Tall, silver-haired, immaculate charcoal coat. The kind of man whose silence seemed more expensive than most people's salaries. 3 executives hurried beside him, trying to keep pace while pretending they weren't rushing. Singapore confirmed attendance. The Zurich numbers came overnight. The board package is waiting in Conference A. Victor nodded once. Minimal movement, maximum pressure. Then, his eyes landed on someone near the security desk. A woman holding a stack of dark blue binders, simple gray blouse, black trousers, no designer signals, no theatrical confidence, just composed efficiency, Elena Vale. Most people in the building knew her vaguely. Operations coordination, deal logistics, senior support analyst. One of those titles corporations invented to hide how much responsibility actually sat on someone's shoulders. But the people who truly mattered inside the machine knew something else. If Elena touched a project, it moved. Quietly. Precisely. Without drama. She noticed the chairman approaching and shifted the binders into one arm. Then she extended her free hand politely. Not eagerly, not submissively. Professionally. "Good morning, Mr. Halbrecht." For half a second, the lobby paused. Victor looked at her hand as though it were a scheduling inconvenience. Then came the sentence, "I don't shake hands with low-level employees." Sharp, casual, public. The words slid through the lobby like a thin blade. Nobody breathed. One assistant immediately stared at the floor. Another pretended to check messages. A junior analyst near the elevators suddenly became fascinated by a wall sculpture. Corporate survival instinct. Never witness humiliation too directly. Elena remained completely still. That was the unsettling part. No nervous laugh, no apology, no defensive reaction. She simply lowered her hand with calm precision, adjusted the binder slightly against her arm, and answered, "Understood." Nothing else. No emotion leaked into her voice, and somehow that made the moment worse. Victor had already turned away before she finished speaking. The executive group followed him toward the elevators, like satellites trapped in orbit around a dying star. When the doors closed, the lobby exhaled all at once. "Oh my God," whispered someone near reception. That was brutal. She shouldn't have done that. "Done what?" said hello. But Elena didn't participate in the post-mortem. She walked calmly toward the operations corridor without changing pace once. Only one person followed her, Martin Reyes from Legal Compliance. Mid-40s, exhausted eyes, tie slightly crooked in the permanent style of men who spent too many years cleaning up expensive disasters. Elena. She kept walking. "Morning, Martin. You okay?" That finally earned him a glance. Not angry, just distant. "You know what's funny?" she said quietly. "People always think disrespect has to be loud to matter." Martin frowned. "He's like that with everyone." "No," Elena replied. "He's careful with people he thinks are important." That sentence stayed with Martin longer than he expected. They entered the operations floor together. Unlike the polished executive wing upstairs, operations looked alive. Screens covered entire walls. Analysts tracked shipping routes, regulatory approvals, acquisition timelines, contract dependencies. Here, mistakes had numbers attached to them. Large numbers. Elena placed the binders onto her desk and immediately resumed work. No visible emotional residue, which unsettled Martin even more. "You know," he said carefully, leaning against her cubicle wall, "half the board thinks the Singapore acquisition closes only because you're coordinating the cross-border approvals." Elena typed without looking up. "Then half the board is smarter than the other half." Martin gave a reluctant smile. There it was, the dry humor, still intact. But underneath it, something had shifted. He could feel it. Across the room, several employees kept stealing glances toward Elena before quickly looking away again. Office ecosystems reacted fast to power imbalance. Nobody wanted to stand too close to someone publicly diminished by the chairman, not because they disliked her, because fear was contagious. Her monitor reflected rows of acquisition data. Singapore Port Authority approvals. European banking compliance, energy corridor licensing, 3 continents, 27 subsidiaries, 1 deal pipeline, valued at approximately $2.3 billion. And Elena knew every moving part inside it. Not generally. Exactly. That was her real talent. While executives performed confidence upstairs, Elena understood where the invisible pressure points lived, which signatures mattered, which regulators hated delays, which banking partners needed personal reassurance before midnight calls, which clauses could collapse 6 months of negotiations if phrased incorrectly. Most executives saw the deal as a trophy. Elena saw the wiring behind the walls. At 9:15 a.m., an emergency scheduling request appeared in her inbox. Board prep session, executive attendance required. No invitation for her. Interesting. 2 minutes later, another message arrived from Arthur Wynn, Chief Financial Officer. "Can you send the Zurich variance files personally? Need them before 10. No greeting. No, please." Classic Arthur. Elena attached the documents immediately. 37 seconds later. "You're a lifesaver." Also classic Arthur. She stared at the message for a moment before closing it. Around her, the office accelerated into controlled chaos. Phones ringing, muted arguments, rapid keyboard clicks. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, rain clouds gathered over the city skyline, turning the morning silver gray. A storm approaching, inside and outside the building. At 10:02 a.m., Elena received a restricted access notification. Her security permissions had changed. She opened the system twice to confirm. Certain executive-level deal folders were now inaccessible to her profile. Her expression didn't change. But Martin, passing by again with a coffee in hand, noticed the stillness immediately. What happened? She rotated the screen slightly toward him. He blinked. No access? That has to be a mistake. Maybe. But neither of them believed that. Martin lowered his voice. "After this morning?" Elena leaned back slowly. The fluorescent lights above cast pale reflections across the glass dividers surrounding the operations floor. In that moment, she looked less like an employee and more like someone quietly recalculating the architecture of a collapsing bridge. "They think visibility equals importance," she murmured. Martin folded his arms. "What does that mean?" "It means people upstairs assume deals happen during presentations." Her eyes moved back to the locked folders. They never noticed the people carrying the oxygen tanks underground. A silence settled between them. Heavy, not dramatic, just dangerous. Across the room, two analysts suddenly stopped talking when Elena looked their direction. Word had spread already. Of course it had. In corporations, humiliation traveled faster than official announcements. At 11:30 a.m., the executive board meeting began upstairs. Glass walls, imported leather chairs. 12 people discussing billions while pretending certainty was a science. Victor Halbrecht stood near the panoramic windows, delivering a controlled monologue about expansion strategy. Confidence radiated from him effortlessly. "The Singapore corridor acquisition positions us for the next decade," he said. "Every major obstacle has already been handled." Arthur Wynne nodded quickly. Several others followed. Agreement in elite rooms often behaved like synchronized swimming. Then one board member asked a small question. Simple, almost forgettable. "Who's overseeing integration sequencing now?" A brief pause. Arthur answered first. "Operations is handling coordination." "Specifically?" Another pause. Victor turned slightly. "Does it matter?" Nobody replied immediately, and for the first time that morning, something almost invisible flickered through the room. Not fear. Not yet, but uncertainty. Tiny. Cold. Like the first crack appearing beneath thick ice. At that exact moment downstairs, Elena closed one folder, opened another, and quietly began transferring several personal notes onto a private encrypted drive. Not company property. Her own documentation. Timelines, dependency chains. Verbal approvals never entered into official systems. Contingency warnings ignored during executive meetings. Nothing illegal, nothing stolen, just knowledge. But knowledge, in the wrong moment, could become more valuable than ownership itself. And somewhere above her, powerful men continued discussing the future as if they fully controlled it. They didn't know the building had already begun shifting beneath their feet, and by tomorrow morning, everyone in that boardroom would understand exactly how dangerous an unimportant employee could become. The terrifying part? Elena still hadn't decided whether she wanted to save the company. Rain hammered against the glass facade of Halbrecht Global long after sunset, turning the city outside into a blurred watercolor of headlights and cold neon reflections. Most of the executive floor had emptied by 8:30, but operations was still alive. Because billion-dollar deals never really slept. They simply changed shifts. Elena sat alone beneath the pale glow of her monitor, one hand resting near a half-finished coffee that had gone cold over an hour ago. The office around her carried that strange nighttime atmosphere unique to corporate buildings. Printers humming in distant corners, ventilation systems whispering through the ceilings, forgotten conversations lingering like ghosts in conference rooms. Her screen displayed a chain of approval sequences tied to the Singapore corridor acquisition. And right in the middle of it sat the problem. A single, red-marked compliance dependency. Tiny, invisible to almost everyone. Fatal if ignored. Elena stared at it without blinking. 3 weeks ago, she had flagged the issue during a risk alignment meeting. She remembered the room perfectly. Polished walnut table, artificial citrus scent from the automated diffusers, executives pretending attentiveness while secretly checking stock updates beneath the table. She had explained the exposure clearly. If the Zurich financing guarantees were transferred before the Singapore maritime authorization finalized, the holding structure would temporarily violate 2 international banking conditions. A narrow timing window, but dangerous. Very dangerous. Arthur Wynne had waved it away almost immediately. "We'll smooth it operationally." Operationally, the favorite word of executives who didn't understand operations. Elena had pushed once more. It could freeze liquidity movement across the pipeline. Arthur smiled the way powerful men smiled when they wanted expertise to stop speaking. We appreciate the caution. Translation: enough. And now, here it was. Still unresolved. Still sitting quietly beneath layers of executive optimism, like a crack inside an aircraft wing. At 8:47 p.m., Martin Reyes appeared beside her desk carrying 2 vending machine coffees. You're still here. You say that every night. Because every night, I hope you'll eventually choose happiness. She accepted the coffee. That sounds expensive. Martin sat across from her and loosened his tie. You heard what happened upstairs? No. Chairman's furious. That narrows it down very little. A tired laugh escaped him. The Zurich partners delayed sign-off again. Elena's eyes remained on the monitor. Of course they did. Martin noticed the tone immediately. You expected it. I warned them. That specific issue? That exact issue. Martin leaned forward slowly. Elena, how bad is this? For the first time all evening, uncertainty flickered across her face. Not fear for herself, fear for scale. That depends, she said quietly. Do they still think this is a presentation problem? Martin said nothing, which answered everything. Outside, thunder rolled across the skyline. Inside the office, another notification appeared on Elena's screen. Access restricted, executive override applied. More folders disappearing. More permissions removed. Interesting timing. Martin read the notification and cursed under his breath. They're locking you out? Looks like it. That's insane. You built half this pipeline structure. No, Elena corrected softly. I maintained it. Important distinction. Her calmness unsettled him more than anger would have, because anger meant emotion. Calm meant conclusions. Across the operations floor, only a handful of employees remained now. Most avoided eye contact with Elena completely. Corporate gravity had shifted. People sensed danger before they understood it, and nobody wanted proximity to whatever was happening around her. Martin lowered his voice further. Listen carefully. Arthur's trying to centralize control upstairs. If they remove you from the acquisition process officially, they already have. No, I mean publicly. That mattered. Public narratives were oxygen in corporations. Once leadership framed someone as support staff, reversing perception became nearly impossible. Elena closed one file slowly. You know what fascinates me? She asked. Martin sighed. This is usually where you say something that ruins my sleep. Executives always believe information belongs to hierarchy. Her eyes moved toward the dark windows overlooking the storm. But information doesn't care about hierarchy. Another silence settled. Heavy again. Then Martin asked the question he had avoided all day. Are you going to walk away? Elena didn't answer immediately. Instead, she opened a small notebook beside her keyboard. Actual paper. Rare in modern offices. Inside were handwritten process chains, names, dates, contingency pathways. Tiny details nobody upstairs would ever bother memorizing. Martin stared at the pages. Jesus. Exactly. You documented all this yourself? I had to. Why? Her expression sharpened slightly. Because nobody else was paying attention. At 9:16 p.m., the executive elevator opened across the floor. Arthur Wynne stepped out first. CFOs always looked slightly exhausted, but Arthur wore exhaustion like a tailored accessory. Perfect suit, perfect haircut, perfect smile engineered for investor calls. Behind him walked 2 senior finance directors. All 3 stopped when they noticed Elena and Martin. The atmosphere changed instantly. Arthur approached with artificial warmth, already prepared. Elena, burning the midnight oil? Someone should. Martin nearly choked on his coffee. Arthur ignored the remark. We're restructuring several reporting flows temporarily. I noticed. Nothing personal. That phrase again. Nothing personal. As if professionalism erased consequences. Arthur rested a hand lightly against the edge of her cubicle wall. The chairman wants cleaner executive visibility. Eliminating operational visibility usually achieves the opposite. One of the finance directors shifted uncomfortably. Arthur's smile tightened almost invisibly. You're frustrated. No, Elena replied calmly. I'm observant. The air between them cooled several degrees. Arthur changed tactics. Look, the board appreciates your contribution. Contribution, another carefully chosen corporate word. Not leadership, not responsibility. Contribution, like she had arranged flowers instead of stabilizing multinational infrastructure financing. Elena leaned back in her chair. Tell me something honestly, Arthur. He hesitated. When the Singapore sequence fails, who exactly are you planning to blame? Silence. Pure silence. One finance director looked down immediately. The other suddenly became interested in his phone. Arthur's expression hardened for the first time. It's not failing. Elena held his gaze. That wasn't my question. For a brief moment, the polished executive mask slipped, and Martin saw it. Fear. Tiny but real. Arthur recovered quickly. You're overestimating your importance to this process. There it was. The real message. Not operational, not procedural, personal. Elena nodded once as though confirming a calculation. Maybe. Arthur straightened his jacket. We'll handle it from here. Then the three executives walked away toward the secured conference corridor. Martin waited until they disappeared. Okay, he whispered. Now I'm terrified. Elena returned her attention to the screen. You should be. At 10:04 p.m., another email arrived. From Automated Compliance Monitoring. Subject, Escalation Trigger. Zurich Exposure Threshold. Elena opened it immediately. Her face went completely still. Martin noticed. What? She turned the monitor slightly. He read the numbers twice, then a third time. Oh no. The Zurich banking bridge had frozen. Not collapsed entirely. Worse. Paused. Mid-transfer. Exactly inside the vulnerability window Elena had warned about, which meant the Singapore acquisition chain could no longer legally finalize on schedule, which meant regulators would demand revalidation, which meant partner confidence could evaporate overnight, which meant... How much exposure? Martin asked carefully. Elena exhaled once. Potentially all of it. Define all. She looked directly at him. 2.3 billion. The number seemed to physically alter the air around them. Even the storm outside felt quieter afterward. Martin sat down heavily. They have no idea upstairs, do they? No. Can this be fixed? Another pause. Longer this time. Yes, Elena admitted. Probably. Probably, but not quickly. And if they mishandle the response? Her expression darkened slightly. Then tomorrow's board meeting becomes a public execution. Across the building, lights still glowed in the executive conference suite, where men in expensive suits continued discussing strategy decks and investor confidence metrics. Completely unaware that the foundation underneath the deal had already begun cracking apart. And the one person who knew how to stop the collapse had just spent an entire day being reminded she was considered unimportant. At 10:31 p.m., Elena finally shut her laptop. Martin stood immediately. You're leaving? Yes. What are you going to do? She slipped the notebook into her bag carefully. Then she answered with terrifying calm. Go home and decide how much disrespect costs. The thunder outside swallowed the silence that followed. And somewhere high above the city, inside brightly lit executive offices, powerful people continued making plans for a future that was already slipping out of their hands. Some disasters arrive like explosions. Others arrive quietly, one ignored warning at a time. And by morning, nobody inside Halbrecht Global would remember the handshake. They would only remember the loss. If you think Elena should walk away and let them face the consequences alone, you already know how dangerous pride becomes inside corporate empires. But the next chapter changes everything, because someone unexpected is about to reveal who truly built the company's biggest successes from the shadows. If this story pulled you into the tension of glass boardrooms, silent power games, and billion-dollar collapses hiding behind polished smiles, stay with me, because the next chapters won't just expose arrogance at the top. They'll reveal how entire corporate empires quietly depend on people nobody bothers to notice until everything starts burning. And trust me, the chairman is about to discover that the most dangerous person in a company is rarely the loudest one in the room. At 6:12 a.m., the rain had stopped. The city outside looked washed clean, all silver rooftops and pale morning fog drifting between skyscrapers like smoke after a battlefield. Inside Halbrecht Global, however, nothing felt clean anymore. By sunrise, panic had already entered the building. Not openly, of course. Corporate panic never arrived screaming. It arrived disguised as urgent calendar adjustments, whispered calls behind glass walls, and executives suddenly walking too fast through hallways while pretending everything remained under control. On the 42nd floor, assistants were being told to cancel investor breakfasts. Legal teams had been pulled into emergency review sessions. 2 external banking consultants had arrived before 7. And somewhere deep inside the executive wing, Arthur Wynne was discovering the horrifying difference between confidence and competence. The boardroom doors opened sharply at 7:03 a.m. Arthur entered first, carrying 3 folders and the expression of a man trying to physically outrun catastrophe. Victor Halbrecht stood near the panoramic windows, hands clasped behind his back. The skyline reflected across the glass around him like fractured steel. "Well?" the chairman asked without turning. Arthur placed the folders onto the table carefully. "There's been a temporary freeze in the Zurich transfer sequence." Victor finally looked at him. "How temporary?" Arthur hesitated 1 second too long. And powerful men noticed hesitation the way sharks noticed blood. "We're evaluating the downstream exposure." Victor's stare hardened. "How much exposure?" Silence. Around the table, several board members avoided eye contact instantly. Nobody wanted ownership of the number. Arthur swallowed once. Potentially the full acquisition pipeline? The room changed. Actually changed. You could feel it physically, like air pressure dropping before an explosion. One board member leaned back slowly. Another removed his glasses. Someone whispered, "Impossible." Victor's voice became dangerously quiet. "How much?" Arthur answered this time without delay. 2.3 billion. The silence afterward was enormous. Not empty, enormous, because numbers that large stopped sounding financial and started sounding geological, like earthquakes, like collapsing glaciers. Victor walked toward the table with measured calm. Too measured, the kind of calm people used moments before destroying careers. "How?" he asked carefully. "Did this happen?" Arthur opened the top folder. There were timing irregularities between the Zurich guarantees and Singapore maritime sequencing. Victor's eyes narrowed. "Were we warned about this risk?" Nobody answered. Not immediately. And that was the moment the room truly became dangerous. Because silence inside boardrooms worked differently than silence anywhere else. Out in the world, silence could mean uncertainty. In executive rooms, silence usually meant guilt, searching for an exit. Victor looked from face to face. Who was handling this deal? Still silence. Then finally, one board member, Eleanor Price from Strategic Oversight, spoke quietly. Elena Vale managed most operational coordination. Arthur's jaw tightened immediately. Victor frowned slightly, searching memory. Elena. The operations analyst from yesterday morning, Eleanor clarified. Understanding landed, and with it came something uncomfortable. Recognition. Victor remembered the handshake, the lobby, the lowered hand, the calm expression afterward. His voice flattened. Bring her in. Arthur shifted instantly. She's not executive level. Victor turned slowly toward him. Neither is a $2.3 billion failure. No one spoke after that, because the sentence had already selected its victim. At 7:41 a.m., Elena entered the building carrying the same gray umbrella she always used during storms. The lobby atmosphere felt different immediately. People watched her too carefully. Conversations paused half a second too late. Fear had spread overnight. Interesting. The receptionist stood as Elena approached. Ms. Vale, the executive board requested you upstairs immediately. Of course they did. Elena thanked her calmly and walked toward the elevators. Every step upward felt strangely quiet, not emotionally, structurally, like entering a building after hearing something crack inside the walls. When the elevator doors opened onto the executive floor, Martin Reyes was already waiting. You're famous now, he muttered. That usually means something's on fire. It is. They walked together down the corridor, lined with abstract artwork expensive enough to fund entire departments. Martin lowered his voice. They know about Zurich. I assumed. Arthur tried to contain it. That must have lasted almost 7 minutes. Despite everything, Martin laughed once, nervously. Elena. She looked at him. They're scared. That finally made her pause, not because the statement surprised her, because Martin sounded shocked by it. Of course they are, she said softly. He rubbed a hand across his face. No, you don't understand. These people never panic publicly. Ever. Elena glanced toward the boardroom doors ahead. Then, today's educational for everyone. The assistant outside the room opened the doors without speaking. Inside, 12 executives turned toward her simultaneously. Anatomically, it resembled a meeting. Emotionally, it resembled a courtroom. Victor Halbrecht remained standing near the windows. Elena Vale. Mr. Halbrecht. No handshake offered this time. Interesting symmetry. Arthur immediately stepped in. We need clarification regarding several operational dependencies. Translation. Please save us. Elena remained standing. Which dependencies? Arthur opened a folder quickly. The Zurich guarantee freeze. Elena nodded once. Yes. Victor's gaze sharpened. You knew this could happen. I warned the finance team 3 weeks ago. Arthur interjected immediately. The risk assessment lacked confirmation thresholds. No, Elena replied calmly. It lacked attention. The room went still again. Victor stepped closer. You're saying this was preventable? Yes. And now? Elena took her time answering, because accuracy mattered, especially now. Now the pipeline is entering regulatory instability. One board member leaned forward. In English, please. Elena looked directly at him. The deal is beginning to collapse. No corporate softening, no executive-friendly language, just truth, raw and cold. Several people visibly paled. Arthur spoke again, faster this time, but recoverable. Elena's silence lasted just long enough to become frightening. Potentially. Victor's expression darkened. What determines that? She met his eyes fully for the first time since the lobby incident. Whether the people making decisions finally listen to the people maintaining the system. There it was. Not revenge, not emotion. A mirror. And somehow, that was worse. Victor stared at her without speaking. For the first time in years, perhaps decades, someone inside his company had spoken to him without visible fear. Not disrespectfully, not dramatically, simply without fear. That unsettled him more than anger ever could. Eleanor Price broke the silence carefully. "Elena, if you were leading response strategy, what would you do first?" Arthur shifted again. Tiny movement, but Elena noticed. Everyone noticed. Power was moving around the room now, quietly, like tectonic plates. Elena walked toward the digital presentation screen and activated the acquisition timeline. Rows of international dependencies illuminated the wall. Complex, dense, alive. Most executives looked overwhelmed instantly because for the first time, they weren't looking at the deal as a trophy headline. They were seeing the machinery underneath it. "All right," Elena said calmly. "Here's the truth." She pointed toward the Zurich sequence. "You tried to accelerate financial visibility before operational stabilization." Another screen appeared. This triggered automated banking restrictions. Another, which endangered Singapore authorization sequencing. Another, which now threatens partner confidence across 3 regions. Nobody interrupted her. Nobody dared, because suddenly the room understood something horrifying. The quiet woman from operations knew more about the company's largest deal than every executive combined. Victor watched her carefully. Not just the information, her composure. No performance, no panic, no ego, just precision. And perhaps for the first time in a very long career, Victor Halbrecht realized he might have mistaken visibility for value. A dangerous mistake. Elena finished the sequence map and looked back at the board. "You still have a narrow recovery window." Arthur exhaled slightly in relief. Then she added, "But it closes in less than 6 hours." Relief vanished immediately. Around the room, panic returned. Sharper this time, harder to hide. Phones vibrated. Assistants moved outside the glass walls. Somewhere in the distance, another executive corridor door slammed shut. The building itself seemed to tense. Victor remained silent for several seconds. Then finally, "What do you need?" A simple question, but inside corporations, those 4 words often marked revolutions, because powerful people only asked them when control had already begun slipping away. Elena closed the presentation slowly, then answered with absolute calm, "Access." Nothing more. Not apology, not recognition, not revenge. Just access. And somehow, that frightened Arthur Wynne more than the missing billions ever had. At 8:14 a.m., the executive floor no longer resembled a corporate headquarters. It resembled an emergency command center pretending to wear an expensive suit. Assistants rushed between conference rooms, carrying updated compliance printouts. Legal teams occupied entire glass offices. Phones rang continuously with the sharp rhythm of institutional panic. Somewhere down the corridor, 2 senior directors were arguing in whispers, intense enough to cut through marble. And in the middle of all of it, Elena Vale sat at the head of the operations response table. Not officially. That was the fascinating part. Nobody had announced a leadership transition. No title had changed. No ceremonial authority had been granted. But crises exposed reality faster than org charts ever could. And reality, at this moment, was brutally simple. Everybody in the building was waiting for Elena to tell them what to do. Victor Halbrecht stood near the far wall, watching silently while teams moved around her. The observation unsettled him more than he expected. People responded to Elena differently than they responded to executives. Not out of fear, out of trust. That distinction mattered. "Open the Singapore authorization channel again," Elena instructed calmly. "Not through legal, through maritime compliance directly." A vice president frowned. "They stopped responding overnight." "They stopped responding to executives overnight," Elena corrected. "Different problem." The man blinked once, then nodded and obeyed. No debate. Another analyst approached quickly. "The Zurich banking representatives want written assurances before reactivation." Elena extended her hand without looking away from the central screen. "Give me the draft." The analyst handed it over instantly. Victor noticed something almost irritating about the interaction. Efficiency. No politics, no performance theater, just movement. Like watching engineers repair a collapsing bridge while executives argued about press releases nearby. Arthur Wynne entered the room moments later carrying fresh reports. His expression had deteriorated significantly in the past hour. Expensive confidence looked very fragile under fluorescent lighting and sleep deprivation. "We have another issue," he announced. Several heads turned immediately. Arthur placed the report beside Elena. The Singapore partners heard about the freeze. Of course they did. They're questioning governance stability. Elena scanned the document quickly. "How many partners?" Arthur hesitated. "All of them." A silence spread across the room. Not shock anymore. Fatigue. The exhausting realization that corporate disasters reproduced faster than solutions. Victor finally spoke. What happens if confidence collapses entirely? Nobody answered immediately. Not because they didn't know, because they did. Elena placed the report down carefully. "The acquisition dies." "Direct." Again. Victor folded his arms. "And the financial exposure?" Arthur answered this time, voice tighter than before. "Potentially catastrophic." One board advisor muttered quietly, "Investors will tear us apart." Another added, "Media too." Elena looked up from the table. "No," she said calmly. "First the banks tear you apart, then investors. Media comes later." The room fell still. Victor studied her carefully again. Interesting, she never dramatized anything. That made every warning feel heavier. Across the digital wall display, international timelines continued ticking downward in red. 5 hours, 11 minutes until regulatory expiration. A countdown. Corporate oxygen draining visibly. Martin Reyes entered carrying updated legal summaries. When he noticed Elena effectively running the room, something almost resembling satisfaction crossed his exhausted face. "Told you," he seemed to think silently. Victor noticed that too. And slowly, uncomfortably, a larger realization began forming. This wasn't a hidden assistant accidentally holding useful information. This woman had been structurally essential for years. The company simply never bothered looking directly at the foundation beneath its own success, because foundations were rarely glamorous, until buildings started collapsing. "Elena," Victor said suddenly. The room quieted instantly. She looked toward him. "You said earlier the recovery window remains open." "Yes." "What's the probability of success?" Every executive in the room watched her. This was the number, the emotional number, the one capable of deciding whether panic stayed controlled or became contagious. Elena considered carefully. "If everyone cooperates?" Victor nodded once. 40%. Several people visibly deflated. Arthur spoke immediately. "Only 40? Elena turned toward him. "You spent 3 weeks ignoring structural risk." No aggression in her tone, which somehow made the sentence hit harder. Arthur looked away first. Interesting. Very interesting. Victor moved closer to the operations table. "What increases the probability?" Elena tapped several sequences onto the main screen. Speed, honesty, and removing unnecessary interference. Her eyes briefly landed on Arthur during the final phrase. Subtle. Surgical. The room noticed anyway. Arthur stiffened. Victor definitely noticed. The chairman's gaze shifted slowly between them, pieces connecting, not emotionally, strategically. He began reviewing internal communications pulled onto one of the side monitors. Risk memos, escalation reports, delayed approvals. And there it was. Elena's warning from 3 weeks ago. Time-stamped, detailed, ignored. Victor read the final paragraph twice, then asked without looking up, "Who approved the override?" Nobody answered. Arthur remained perfectly still. Too still. Victor raised his eyes. Arthur. The CFO adjusted his cuffs reflexively. We believed acceleration was necessary to maintain investor momentum. We. Arthur hesitated. Tiny mistake. In consultation with finance leadership. Victor's expression became unreadable, dangerously unreadable. Around the room, people suddenly found other documents extremely interesting. Corporate instinct again, never stand near a falling chandelier. Elena returned to work without commenting further. And somehow, that restraint made the atmosphere even more uncomfortable because she wasn't trying to expose Arthur. Reality was doing it naturally. A young analyst hurried over moments later. Sveal, Singapore Maritime finally responded. The room snapped to attention. Elena took the call immediately on speaker. A sharp British accented voice filled the room. Halbrecht Global? Elena Vale speaking. Brief pause. Then the tone changed instantly. Ah, Ms. Vale. Victor noticed that. Everyone noticed it. Recognition, respect, real respect. Not hierarchy-based, competence-based. We were informed your executive team experienced complications. The official continued diplomatically. That's accurate. We suspended progression because prior assurances became inconsistent. Elena nodded once. Understandable. Arthur looked increasingly pale. The official continued. Frankly, Ms. Vale, you're the only reason we haven't terminated the sequence already. Silence detonated across the room. Not loud, but devastating. Victor's eyes moved slowly toward Arthur, then back toward Elena. The official wasn't finished. You've always been the reliable side of this operation. Reliable side, not support staff, not coordinator. The reliable side. Elena kept her voice steady. We still have a recovery pathway. Do we? Yes. A pause. Then, all right, I'll hold the authorization window open another 3 hours. Relief flashed across multiple faces instantly, but Elena's expression remained focused. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, the official replied. Fix your leadership structure. The call ended. Nobody spoke afterward. Nobody knew how to, because an external international authority had just revealed the humiliating truth in front of the entire board. The corporation's most critical global relationships trusted Elena more than its executives. Arthur finally broke. This is absurd. Every head turned. She's operation staff, he snapped. We're acting like she built the entire acquisition herself. Elena slowly looked up. The room became very quiet. Arthur continued, voice sharpening under pressure. This company cannot function based on one mid-level employee holding undocumented influence over international partners. Victor answered before Elena could. Apparently, it already does. The sentence landed like a hammer. Arthur froze, and for the first time all morning, genuine fear entered his eyes fully. Because he finally understood something terrible. The crisis was no longer only financial. It was political. Power inside Halbrecht Global was rearranging itself in real time, and everyone in the room could see it happening. Elena closed another compliance file carefully. Outside the glass walls, the skyline had brightened into pale morning gold. Beautiful, cold, unforgiving, just like the room itself. Then another alert appeared on the central monitor. Urgent, investor communication, leak detected. Martin read it first, then looked toward Elena slowly. This, he said quietly, just became war. And somewhere deep inside the executive floor, beneath panic, money, ego, and collapsing control, Victor Halbrecht began realizing the most expensive mistake of his career had never been the Zurich override. It had happened yesterday morning in the lobby, when he refused to shake hands with the one person holding his empire together. By 11:26 a.m., the crisis had escaped containment. Inside Halbrecht Global, every screen seemed to glow with some new variation of disaster. Investor forums were circulating rumors about acquisition instability. Financial journalists had begun calling the communications department every 6 minutes. 2 banking partners demanded emergency reassurances. And somewhere on the 38th floor, a senior vice president had apparently locked himself inside a conference room after learning his stock compensation package might evaporate before lunch. The building no longer felt corporate. It felt atmospheric, like standing inside a plane losing altitude while the cabin crew continued smiling professionally. On the executive floor, Elena remained astonishingly calm. Not relaxed, focused. There was a difference. She stood beside the central operations display, reviewing revised stabilization sequences while teams moved around her in controlled urgency. Martin approached carrying another legal tablet. "You've officially become terrifying." "I was always terrifying. People just confused quietness with weakness." "That's honestly fair." Despite everything, the corner of her mouth almost moved. Almost. Across the room, Victor Halbrecht watched the exchange silently. The chairman had barely left the operations floor in 3 hours. That alone was historic. Normally, Victor existed at a strategic altitude far above procedural crises. He dealt in acquisitions, governments, institutional leverage. He rarely entered operational spaces personally because, in his worldview, systems existed to protect leadership from mechanics. But now, mechanics were all that remained, and Elena navigated them better than anyone else in the company. Arthur Wynne, meanwhile, looked progressively less stable with each passing minute. Sweat gathered near his collar, despite the freezing temperature of the conference floor. He reviewed documents too aggressively, spoke too quickly, interrupted people at the wrong moments. Classic signs, not of incompetence, of collapse. At 11:41 a.m., the communications director rushed into the room. "We have a leak source." Victor turned immediately. "Who?" The director hesitated. "Internal finance distribution." Every eye in the room shifted toward Arthur. The CFO straightened instantly. "You think I leaked this?" "No one said that," Victor replied, but the damage was already done. Because suspicion inside executive environments spread like poison gas, invisible, fast, impossible to fully remove afterward. Arthur stepped forward sharply. This entire situation exists because operational controls weren't centralized properly. Elena didn't even look up from the screen. "No," she said calmly. "This situation exists because warnings were treated like inconveniences." Arthur's jaw tightened. "You keep speaking as though you alone understand this company." Elena finally turned toward him. The room quieted instinctively again. "No," she answered softly. "I speak like someone who actually listened." That hit harder than shouting ever could. Victor noticed something then. Nobody defended Arthur anymore. Not openly, not subtly. The room had already chosen who it trusted. And power, once emotionally redistributed, almost never returned to its original structure intact. A young analyst suddenly called out from across the room, "Zurich reopened preliminary review." Movement exploded instantly. 3 teams converged around the central display. Martin exhaled sharply. "That's good, right?" Elena's eyes narrowed while reviewing the update. "Potentially." Victor frowned slightly. "You use that word often. Because certainty is how corporations end up in crises like this." Another uncomfortable truth, delivered without drama. Victor almost respected that. Almost. The analyst continued reading. "They want direct confirmation from operational leadership before restoring sequence authorization." Arthur immediately stepped forward. "I'll handle it." "No," Elena said. "Elena." The single word stopped him cold. Not loud, not emotional. Absolute. Arthur stared at her. "You don't have authority to make that decision." Before Elena could answer, Victor spoke. "She does now." Silence crashed across the room. Complete silence. Even the analysts stopped moving. Arthur blinked once, as though the sentence physically failed to process. Victor remained calm. Effective immediately. Elena Vale oversees Stabilization Authority on the Singapore acquisition. No ceremony, no speech, but everyone understood the magnitude instantly. A mid-level operations employee had just been granted control over the corporation's most critical international deal, directly over the CFO's objection. Inside executive ecosystems, that was an adjustment. That was blood in the water. Arthur's face lost color. This is reckless. Victor's gaze hardened. No, reckless was ignoring her. The room stayed frozen. Elena herself seemed almost uninterested in the political earthquake happening around her. She simply turned back toward the screen. Get Zurich on a secure call. The analysts moved immediately. Again, no hesitation, no confusion over chain of command, because legitimacy behaves differently than hierarchy. Hierarchy is assigned, legitimacy is recognized, and everyone in the room now understood who actually knew how to keep the company alive. At 12:03 p.m., the Zurich representatives appeared on the conference display. 3 executives, 1 compliance officer, 1 external banking observer. The atmosphere felt surgical. A gray-haired banker adjusted his glasses. Ms. Vale. Elena is fine. We have concerns regarding governance integrity. Reasonable. Victor watched carefully from the side of the room. Again, Elena didn't defend the company emotionally. She addressed reality directly. No executive inflation, no branding language, no strategic theater, just clarity. The banker continued. We need assurance operational authority, now aligns with risk oversight. Elena answered immediately. It does. Arthur shifted visibly beside the wall. The banker noticed. Everyone noticed. Will prior financial override procedures continue? Elena's voice became cooler. No. Arthur inhaled sharply. Victor never looked at him. The banker leaned back slightly. Interesting. Even through a screen, relief became visible. We also require confirmation that future escalation warnings will not be suppressed internally. The room went very still, because suddenly, the conversation wasn't only about money anymore. It was about accountability. Elena could have destroyed Arthur in that moment. 1 sentence would have done it. 1 detailed explanation. 1 public timeline. Instead, she answered differently. Future warnings will be documented through transparent review channels. Martin stared at her from across the room. She's protecting him, not entirely, but enough. And somehow that made Arthur look even smaller, because mercy from someone you dismissed publicly felt unbearable. The Zurich representative nodded slowly. All right. Another pause. Then finally, we'll reopen the pipeline. The room exhaled collectively. Not celebration. Survival. A narrow bridge restored over open air. Analysts immediately resumed movement around the operations floor. Calls restarted. Timelines updated. Compliance teams accelerated into motion again. Crisis not over, but no longer terminal. Victor remained motionless near the windows, watching Elena. Really watching her now. The precision, the restraint, the complete absence of ego after gaining power. Most people changed the moment authority touched them. Elena became calmer. That realization unsettled him deeply. At 12:37 p.m., the room had stabilized enough for exhaustion to finally appear on people's faces. Martin sat heavily beside Elena. You just saved a multinational corporation. Temporarily. You know normal people would enjoy hearing that sentence. I'm not convinced normal people work here. Fair point. Across the room, Arthur quietly gathered several documents into a folder. His movements had become slower. Older somehow. Victor noticed him preparing to leave. Arthur. The CFO stopped immediately. The chairman walked toward him with measured calm. No audience performance now. No public destruction. Somehow that made the moment heavier. Victor spoke quietly enough that only nearby people could hear. You were warned. Arthur looked downward briefly. Yes. And you ignored it. A longer silence. Yes. Victor nodded once. Tiny movement. Final movement. We'll discuss your future later. Arthur understood instantly. Everyone nearby understood instantly. Corporate executions rarely required dramatic wording. Arthur left without another sentence. The glass doors closed behind him softly. And just like that, one of the most powerful men in the company disappeared from the center of its gravity. No applause followed, only silence, because survival had exhausted everyone too deeply for victory. Several minutes later, the operations floor finally began emptying gradually. The emergency intensity softened. Breathing returned. Outside, sunlight broke fully through the clouds at last, spilling gold across the skyline and into the boardroom windows. Victor approached Elena carefully. Different energy now. No arrogance, no performance, just unusual hesitation. Elena. She looked up from the final compliance review. For the first time since the lobby incident, Victor Halbrecht seemed uncertain what language to use. Interesting transformation for a man who usually controlled every room he entered. Finally, he extended his hand. The same hand that had refused hers yesterday morning. The room noticed instantly. Of course it did. Corporate buildings remembered symbolic moments better than policy changes. Victor's voice remained low. I misjudged you. Elena looked at the offered hand for one quiet second. Not dramatically, not triumphantly. Then she stood and shook it, professional, steady, nothing more. But somehow that simple gesture carried more weight than the entire billion-dollar acquisition surrounding them, because everyone watching understood the real truth now. Companies loved to celebrate visionaries. But empires survived because of invisible people holding collapsing systems together while executives collected applause above them. Victor released her hand slowly. You should have been in that boardroom years ago. Elena answered with calm precision. I was. He frowned slightly. She gathered her notebook and closed the final file. You just never noticed. And for perhaps the first time in his entire career, Victor Halbrecht had absolutely no response,